Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today with Discussions with the Fascia Masters. My name is Deanna Hansen. I'm a certified athletic therapist and the founder of Fluid Isometrics and Block Therapy. And I'm being joined by my nephew, Quinn Castellane, a lead block therapist and the VP of Block Therapy, and our very, very special guest today, Dr. L. Now, I have had the opportunity of being on Dr. L's Health, Wealth, and Wisdom Summit, as well as being a guest on his fitness platform. So Dr. L, you have so many incredible things that you're doing, so many different people that you're sharing with, and all these other things. So I'm just going to pass it over to you because I want everybody to hear from you what you're doing.
Thank you, Deanna. That was a wonderful introduction. I'm glad to be here. Nice to meet you, Quinn. I'm very happy to be here.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, I am a clinical neuroscientist. I got my postdoctorate in neurodevelopmental disorders, and I had a private practice for 10 years helping children with autism spectrum disorders. I was one of America's top doctors, actually, a couple of times, and we had an award-winning practice before I decided to move on to the online world and be more of a prevention type of a physician and work on the prevention side of things, basically. I grew up with ADHD myself, so I did identify with the children. I was actually one of those kids that, was described as bright and would get the point of the class in the first 10 minutes and would spend the remaining 50 minutes disrupting the, the class. So I apologize to all the moms and the teachers and out there for having to deal with people like me. Anyways, success story, long story short, I made it. It's amazing that I lasted through the academia for as long as I did with my ADHD. And I was happy to be able to help those children recover and get their lives back, see the relationship with their parents back, see the bonds strengthen, social bonds, friendships, so on and so forth. So, and academics as well, of course. So, and then of course, here I am now with my present company, Role Model Maker, and we are trying to change people's lives, change humanity and humanity's potential by helping our parents lead by example and leading a thriving life, of course.
Amazing. So when we were doing that Health, Wealth, and Wisdom Summit together, you had me as a guest talking about health. And of course, we dove into fascia and breathing and the benefits. Can you share some of the other topics that you were addressing in that summit? Because I think all of the people here in my community would totally love to understand what you know and how we can really make the best impact for our parents, our grandparents, and our kids moving into the future.
Absolutely. Well, we've had a couple of summits now, and it has been met with tremendous welcome and basically pleasure. And what we have decided to do is to go ahead and continue this on. So the next one that we're going to be having is going to be in March 16th. So mark your calendars, guys. But Health, Wealth, and Wisdom, the Parents Edition Summit, is something where I wanted to bring all the different experts. And over the past couple of times that we've done this, we've had experts from 17 different time zones, literally from across the globe, talk about everything from different aspects of health and fitness that comes into making sure that we as parents lead healthy lives, so that the kids, because their brains are reality emulators and they look at how we lead our lives, they go ahead and internalize that and they think that's just the normal way of doing things. So it's much easier to practice and lead by example than to preach. So there's a health component, then there's the wealth component as well. And of course, recently, because of the pandemic, we've had a lot more interest as far as that part of it is concerned. Everything from how families could talk about finances, how to get kids introduced to money management techniques and things like that, and as well as retirement investment techniques that the whole family can participate in and understand, so that the welfare of the family is taken care of. And then lastly, wisdom. Now, this is a very broad topic. We've had everything from parenting to all these other things like spousal relationships and communication, to how to show up in life and how to find your message and how to be confident in what you do and how to lead a life, basically be a role model. So all of those have been part of it. So usually over a 2-day period, we have over 30 speakers that come and present on various topics. So it's a pretty intense 2 days, but oftentimes people say we did not know there was just so much support for parents out there and for families out there. So I definitely invite and encourage everybody to be there.
So, with today's situation, what do you see as being one of the number one factors in people's health?
So being a clinical neuroscientist, of course, I have some biases that, health flows from top down and inside out. So if you want to show up as the full self, if you guys believe that your brain controls not only what goes on inside of you, but how you show up in the world, then you want to make sure you optimize the brain, right? So that's where my starting point is. And of course, whenever there is challenges, rather than to deal with the challenge, my focus has always been to go ahead and strengthen from within, top down, inside out. So you want to be more resilient against COVID and have a better immune system. You want to be able to show up and make more money in life. You want to be able to be a better parent or a spouse. Make sure that you are in your thrive inside, and then also how you show up outside. So when with that, that means that we need to make sure that our brain is optimized, that it is actually something that can work as best as it can. And in order for us to ask our body to do anything, we want to make sure that first we support our body. I always say, support your body so it in return can go ahead and support you. So when it comes to the brain, it's no different. Of course, with our brains, it's much more plastic, it's much more changeable, and the results are super fast. Sometimes you can see the results within seconds, basically. And of course, Diana, you understand with fitness, that's a direct relationship with stimulating the brain, mind, body, connecting. And when it comes to supporting your brain, there are these foundational pieces that need to be there. First of all, you need the foundational piece, the building blocks and the fuel that your brain needs. So there's the nutrition part of it. Then there is the resting and the oxygenation. The oxygen is required so that you can burn the fuel. It's just like having a jet engine, giving it fuel, but then if you're in outer space, it can't work because it needs the oxygen. A lot of times people overlook this. Many times in clinic, I used to see that kids that were coming down with like upper respiratory infections like colds and flus, they would show up these symptoms in their performance a day or two before they had any symptoms when it came to oxygen saturation and how their blood was showing that oxygen level. So rest, food, and oxygenation is that foundational piece to support the brain. Now, the thing about the brain is that if you have this support, it needs to now connect. It needs to connect within itself and it needs to connect to the body. One of the things that happens developmentally is that when a child is born, the more intelligent species are, the longer it takes for that baby to become a viable unit. And that's because there's more neurons that need to connect and interconnect and be able to work together. And we as humans can take up to a couple of years to go ahead and do that. And some of the more seasoned parents might say up to a couple of decades, actually, just to get that all sorted out. But in general, you need a couple of years for these neural connections to form. We don't have the biggest brains in the world, but what makes our brain powerful is the fact that it can connect many different parts and all the different parts are super specialized. So it's not like one side and one part can compensate for another one. So every single part needs to do its job and do it as best as it can. So that connectivity is essential. And that connectivity comes from stimulation. The deeper brain centers need to be stimulated, and they, in turn, being the maestro of the brain, start coordinating and arranging the front and the back and the left and the right and all these things to work together. Now, how does the brainstem get that stimulation? Via the spinal cord, movement, gravity, and all the stuff that needs to happen within the body. The signals that come from fast motor movements are the strongest signals that can stimulate the brain. And oftentimes in nowadays, when we have a sedentary lifestyle, those are the very kind of neurons that we don't stimulate at all. And we're getting most of our stimulation through our eyes or maybe ears, and that's about it. And then in that process, our brain rewires itself differently. So the brain of somebody that lives today and sits in front of TV and plays video games and is doing Zoom calls all day is wired very differently than somebody from 100 years ago that would get up in the morning and would have a very active lifestyle. And we see time and time again that by incorporating those into our life, then your brain is capable of rewiring itself and going back to the way it was basically and gain its health as well. So I don't know, I'm rambling on, so let me
No,
know.
you're not. This is fantastic because I mean it's amazing when I look at the youth today and I see the postures and I see their inability to breathe properly because of the compression from growing up in front of technology. It terrifies me to a degree because I can relate in my own body when I went through the process of learning how to breathe diaphragmatically and the positive changes that occurred and knowing where I started from, where I wasn't growing up in front of technology, and now seeing the kids today and seeing how riddled they are with compression and blockages. And I think that's probably why we connected so well right in the beginning, because we were talking a very similar language from a different perspective, where I feel it is all about oxygen as well. So are you, from the time that you started working with kids until now, are you seeing quite a difference in the development of the children today because of all of the struggles they're having with life?
Yeah, I mentioned to you that when I was growing up, I had ADHD, for instance. At that time, the rate of autism spectrum disorders was 1 in 10,000. Currently, that number sits at 1 in 58. So initially, when this stuff happened, people were thinking, oh, you know what, it's the genetics, or, they were thinking about these illnesses. And the fact of the matter is that it can't possibly be genetics, because only if the autism spectrum disorder kids were the only ones that were repopulating the earth would the numbers increase so drastically. And some people say, well, you know what, it's the increased awareness and the diagnosis. And while part of that is true, that still does not explain the fact that why it is so much more prevalent today as it was before. It's not like before there was more cases that were being undiagnosed. The studies actually take that into account and still show that there's a lot more of them, especially when you're talking about low functioning autism spectrum disorders. You end up seeing those a lot more, and those didn't exist before. The fragility of our nervous system has really come forth because of this modern lifestyle, basically. So you hear things about vaccinations causing autism. It's not that. I mean, we should be resilient. We should be able to resist those kind of challenges and strains and stresses on our body. But what happens is that as we are more fragile, more systems can fail, and the brain is much more likely to go ahead and give up and blow a fuse, literally. So basically, that's what we're seeing. When COVID hit, one of the first things I said was, listen, COVID is not the first of these outbreaks, and it's not going to be the last one. And you also need to realize that as this thing spreads and goes around the world, this is back in March of last year. I said, as this thing spreads and goes around the world, the more people it infects, and every time it divides, there's chance for mutation. And then there is these different strands of COVID that never have existed before. And now we're seeing that some of those things are starting to come about. But so if you go and try to chase this thing so that you go ahead and develop this vaccine for this COVID, and then here's a new strand, so now we have to develop a new vaccine for that one. And later on, it's a completely different virus. You're playing this catch-up game, and you never can catch up with Mother Nature in that sense. The best way, and that's actually what my TEDx talk coming up this weekend is all about, is actually making sure that you optimize your potential and in turn humanity's potential in that sense.
So what are some of the exercises and disciplines you guide the parents to so that they can in turn be the example for their kids?
Right. So again, that's a great question. So let's go back to when I was in private practice. The kids would be coming in. Now, of course, because your brain controls the function of everything else in your body, if it's not functioning right, oftentimes you have many other issues too. So these kids would have movement issues, they might have social issues or academic issues, they might end up having digestive issues, allergy and respiratory and immune function issues. So there's all these things, and the parents are just speech issues. So the parents are going from doctor to doctor and therapist to therapist, strained thin financially and in their own relationships, because they're trying to throw everything at it so that hopefully something sticks. And when it comes to the brain, the more specific we are, the better the results. So one of the things that I was a big proponent of, I do not believe in like whole body stretches where you just go ahead and do this. I believe in being specific and addressing what needs the stimulation. For instance, if you go ahead and you stretch your hamstrings and one of them is tighter than the other one, well, when you stretch both of them, yes, you have more flexibility, but the discrepancy still exists there. So now what you've done is now you have increased your capability to do more activities, but just like a car that now instead of going 15 miles an hour is going 50 miles an hour, if you get into an accident, if you have an injury, the damage is that much worse, right? So it is much better to equalize things. And this goes back to my traditional Chinese medicine training as well, that when they did the acupuncture training, it wasn't just enough to go ahead and balance the meridians, but you also wanted to balance the meridians from left to right side of the body, because that discrepancy oftentimes was much more important than just having one meridian being high or low, for instance. So as far as going back to the question of did I recommend, I always talked about going back to the basics, just like development. So in development, evolutionarily and in embryologically, morphologically speaking, when you look at how creatures move, when you look at how humans learn to move, the first thing that we do is we learn to strengthen our spinal muscles and our core muscles. And then, of course, when they're born, the very first exercise we do is what? Take a deep breath. So that breathing and that coordination of your core and your breathing becomes the first and essential movement that stimulates your digestive tract, that stimulates the cerebrospinal fluid to go through and cycle through. So all of these things become synchronized and connected. Then when you look at it, the next movement that the babies learn to do is actually movement in gravity, because when you're in utero, you're in this fluid and your mom is carrying you around and it's almost like a cradle, right? Just whenever they walk. But when you go ahead and you come out, now you are not in this liquid. Now you are actually in gravity. You have to hold yourself, or you're resting against the bed or the crib, whatever it happens to be. And you need to go ahead and learn to hold your head up, and you need to be able to sit up. And all of those things is movement against gravity. That's how you get all the curvatures in the spine. And those curvatures are important for making sure that you have shock absorption, that you have stability, so that later on, when you start getting on fours and twos, that you can go ahead and endure a fall and not break your bones or blow a disc and things like that. And of course, babies are a lot more flexible. So in the process, they make up for that lack of coordination and the injuries that might occur from it. So it's the same process of going through this, making sure that you address your core, making sure you address your breathing, then learning to make sure you move whole bodily in gravity, basically, to coordinate your arms and the legs. That simple act of walking, how we walk with our left foot going forward and our right hand going forward, and then the other one's being back and swinging it backward. That timing is essential. Oftentimes with autism spectrum disorder, all you have to do is just watch how the kids walk, and you can see they're either walking on their toes, or they're walking on their heels, or they move one side of their body and then the other side of their body. And in that process, what that's telling you is that those different brain centers are not coordinating the way they ought to. And as a result, later on, the coordination of thoughts, the coordination of impulses and behaviors and priorities, all of those things become compromised.
So do you see that, compared to that brain 100 years ago where activity was so completely different than it is today, do you see that the brain can be rewired to its perfection, if you want to call it that, compared to what's actually happening today? with a lot of
I
kids?
would say that because, especially over the past 25, 30 years, we have learned about neuroscience quite a lot and we have understood. And it's funny because, you might hear that people said, oh, the brain never regenerates, or you've got whatever you've got, that's as much as you got. But then we also knew that people who would end up surviving a stroke within that year after the stroke, a lot of times they would get many of their abilities back. So how is it that they were able to get those abilities back? And that is the neuroplasticity. There's a movie called The Brain That Changes Itself. And it's an amazing story about how the brain can go ahead and reprograms and rewire itself, even bypass areas that are no longer working so that it can go ahead and achieve the task that it does. Now, when it comes to the 100 years ago versus today, it's still the same brain. The lifestyle has changed, but still the same brain. The plasticity is also there. So that means that we can go ahead and improve our brain and get it back to its healthy state. Now, I will give this disclaimer that we have this amazing window till before puberty. And some of us might already know that once you hit puberty, it's downhill from there. But there's this amazing window that if there is any dysfunction, if there is any imbalance in the brain before that age, oftentimes you can work on it to the point where you can actually resolve it or improve it drastically to the point where it might not even show up or be apparent anymore. After that age, we learn to compromise and compensate. And this is actually where a lot of times when you start seeing things like scoliosis, when you start seeing some of these other symptoms that are compensation for other problems that have existed and now it's manifesting itself in the individual in a physical way. And so what ends up happening is these things now become hardwired and becomes much more difficult to go ahead and eradicate completely. But the good news is that you can still work on it and reverse it. It's an uphill battle that now you have to constantly focus on it because now that is your weakness, basically. That's something that you need to address all the time. I'll give you a perfect example. Back in my chiropractic days, we had truck drivers, right? And the truck drivers were sitting long hours and driving. So I'm like, so long as you're going to be a truck driver, these are the things you have to do to offset and compensate and fix the things that happens as a result of your work, right? So whether you're a computer worker, whatever you do in life, there are certain things that you do over and over and over again. And that kind of golfers, they swing one side. So what do they have to do? They have to do the reverse of it to train the other side. Tennis players, anything that you do that tends to emphasize one set of muscle groups, then you have to naturally go ahead and counter it as such.
I love that. I didn't realize The Brain That Changes Itself is a movie. I read the book. That was by Norman Doidge, I believe. And I was so excited to read that. I think I read it about 8 or 10 years ago or something like that. And because I've believed that the brain can absolutely rewire, and I've seen it through the process of what we do with block therapy, and we deal with a lot of people with scoliosis, and we're able to really change the pattern of movement. And I always believe that when you're changing the pattern and you can bring balance and symmetry into the body, that's also going to translate up into the brain. And I know that on our call we had, our fitness call, we talked about that little boy Zenon who we're working with, who 6 years old, and because he was so excited about learning the crossbow, he would spend 3 to 4 hours a day just pulling his body in one direction. And then he ended up with this scoliosis. And within 9 weeks, because we had him training the opposite side and undoing those fascial adhesions that took him into that alignment, he really changed. And what was also so amazing for me was the first time I spoke with the family, he was like your typical 6-year-old kid. He was, playing and he was distracted. And then by the third time, 6 weeks later that I had him, he's sitting facing me, parents on both sides, and he is so incredibly present and articulate. And it was like a completely different child. I was truly blown away by that. So so I'm so excited. Quinn, do you have anything you'd like to add in here or share at this time?
I'm just really enjoying this conversation, to be honest. This is really, really cool. I'm learning a whole lot. And yeah, like I love how you were mentioning, Dr. L, about not just like your hamstrings, not just going and try to lengthen both of your hamstrings if one's bound up in a knot, because that's still going to create that inequality. So even how I see a lot of this, because I come from more of a bodybuilder background, which I'm not saying is the right way of training the body by any means, but it is interesting because you focus a lot on symmetry, but there's also that compression aspect where you're beating your muscle and your fascia up, and then it just results into more scar tissue and then blocks more blood flow. So you kind of go in this like this circle in a sense, but then that leads down to a downward spiral. But yeah, like even how I'm starting to approach things is very similar to what you said. Like you need to find your inequalities. Absolutely. So Deanna and I like to say, like, we need to awaken, then strengthen. So we need to release the fascia, awaken that area, and then strengthen it in its correct alignment. But before we do that, people aren't aware really of their bodies. And it's so true. Like I'm in front of my computer it can be 12 hours a day easily. And it definitely can change how your brain functions. So I think initially when people either like follow a protocol that you create, that we create, whatever it is, they're going to start to be more in tune with their body. And once they're more in tune with their body, then like even what I'm thinking for the Block for Fitness section, like this would be really cool because we need to teach people how to be very self-aware with themselves. How can we get people to just understand their foundations, understand just basic anatomy and how the body moves, and then train them to find their inequalities. Like, hey, let's go into a forward bend. Now let's feel which hamstring is more restricted. Okay, my right hamstring is way more restricted, so let's block that. And now we need to strengthen that and bring awareness. Or even like a core rotation, which is massive for the spine, because you're talking about so much about the spine and how we need that to have the proper like spinal fluid and movement, because that all correlates to the brain. Like for me, I almost developed scoliosis from bodybuilding, because as soon as I was growing out of alignment, and that could have started initially from my ankle injury when I shattered it when I was younger, then that resulted to everything up the chain. And now my hips could have been off from that. So then if I'm bench pressing or I'm squatting or I'm deadlifting and my hips are off, now I had this big protrusion on the left lower side of my back. And then that resulted to everything up the chain. So it's just so cool to see how it all results, but how that also connects to the brain. And to get kids, like I totally agree, that window is so crucial and so important. If we can get them in at that young age, they're at that huge advantage. But then at the same time, it's like, yes, there's that uphill battle. But for people who have issues with cognitive function or inabilities, there's still hope, which is really good to know as well. And we're seeing that in our community. I'm seeing it. I'm sure you're seeing it. So yeah, no, again, this is really, really cool. And I'm actually looking forward to watching and listening to your TED Talk as well.
And on that note, can you share what you're going to be talking about on your TED Talk? I'm so excited.
So so it is a TEDx talk. It's a TEDx Tenaya Paseo is the event, and it's happening this weekend. And the title of my talk is unlocking your child's potential by optimizing your brain. And the topic is optimizing humanity's potential within one generation, because we are the teachers of the next generation. So we have this opportunity, this blank slate, to kind of rewrite history as we want to see it and not perpetuate the problems forward. And it all starts with the basics. So without going into more detail,
save it for the talk. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Well, I am so excited too, because we have a goal to launch our Block Therapy Academy for kids in the fall of this year. And to know that, as you shared, there's this window of time. Like we really want to get kids in when they're at a minimum 6 years old. to really start embracing this body work, this understanding. And in fact, even in our membership, we also have exercises where we teach parents how to engage a baby's breath. I'm seeing today that kids are not breathing with the same strength of the diaphragm as they were in past. So to be able to get parents to actively become participants in getting that core, that spine to work with the gravity, that's part of what we do, so that by the time they're a little bit older and they're more conscious, they can actually start doing that self-care component, and they can really awaken their bodies and their cells and get their brains open and spacious. Because again, for us, it's all about balance and symmetry from the perspective of fascia, how we approach it. And just it's amazing. It was, I think, 3 years ago when Quinn and I went to see the remake of the movie It by Stephen King. I saw it in the 80s, and it was amazing because in the remake, it was the identical movie where the kids are wearing, you know, the styles of the 80s, hairstyles of the 80s, but the posture of today. So the kids were really twisted and different. So we came back after we saw the movie and we pulled up the original cast and then the cast from 3 years ago. And it was mind blowing, the difference in the postures. And when I really first realized it was when my dad used to love watching old movies. So I remember, you know, watching them with him, and it didn't matter the size of a person. They all had these beautiful V-shaped bodies, broad shoulders. They would come in at the waist. There was no collapsing. And we see that so strongly today because, again, of how we basically turned into little puddles in front of the computer.
Yep.
So to build
it's
proper,
amazing.
yeah.
It's amazing because what you just actually, there's two things that you said I just wanted to comment on. One is about the breathing, and I'm really glad that you're doing this with the younger population. I literally yesterday was talking to my babysitter who had her daughter over, and I noticed that when the child was speaking, she had to pause to breathe and to continue because she hadn't gotten used to coordinating this, and this mouth breathing and the proper breathing is essential. There's plenty of studies that show how kids' IQs literally drop as they age in those first 10 years when they don't breathe properly. So it is foundational, essential for these things to happen. And then, of course, that's just the beginning of it. A child that doesn't breathe properly doesn't have a strong core, so they're more likely to injure themselves. And nowadays, I see kids getting into sports younger and younger, and they are trying to really go at it and eventually become professionals. But in that process, before they even have a chance, they're injuring themselves. And some of these things become permanent injuries because they never took the time to actually go ahead and observe that symmetry, observe that coordination, and all the elements that go into building that foundational piece. So yeah, and then with the posture thing, what you were talking about, I remember when we were going through our neurologic training, and there was a portion that was designed for ergonomics, posture, and gait. And we would watch the first 10 seconds of a marathon. And we would see the people running from the front and running from the side. And you could, with accuracy, tell who the top finishers of the race would be based on that posture and ergonomics, because the posture that is not right is less efficient, and it would wear out and it would cause pain points and stress points and all these other things. So it was amazing to see that before the race happened, regardless of training, you could just see what you're describing with the fascia really being the determinant as far as their performance.
Wow, that's fascinating. I feel that the lack of free play that kids have today is also something that's really impacting things. I mean, for me, you know, where I grew up, it was safe. You know, there was a bunch of kids on the street and we would play hide and seek. We didn't lock the doors. Parents wouldn't like have their eyes on their kids. So you'd be running in a park, you'd be climbing trees, you'd be, you know, you'd be using your body in its way it was designed to be used. Where I have a sense that, not having kids personally, but I have a sense that today everything is so organized, like the organized sports, the organized play. You don't have that ability to extend your body and to hang and to do all the things that would have really created a different growing pattern than when we are so like in sports, I mean, everything is a unidirectional rotation. You know, I mean, for me, once I hit, I was a little older, I started playing volleyball. And I know that to this day, I am still working through the deep adhesions that I created from as a power hitter. However many times I put that right hand over top and I had that killer spike and killer serve, and I was so proud of that. But I think today of how many times did I rotate over to the left only and never to the right, and how that just impacted everything as I grew, not to mention the injuries that I had as a kid. In fact, it's funny because we're putting out a blog in February, and I have a four-part series on my chronic pain. I've been unraveling a hip injury for about 4 years, and I really wanted to explain the process because as a result, I remember when I was 3 years old, we'd been camping, and the next morning I go down to the fire pit. The night before, we had this raging fire, and I'm 3 and I sit in it. And then I hear my mom calling me, and I put my foot there and I stepped on this burning hot coal. And I ended up with a 3rd-degree burn on my arch. Now, what's funny is, of course, my mom takes me to the doctor, and the doctor says, well, you can't weight bear. And I think it was for a couple of weeks, but I never crawled. My mom told me I went from lying down to walking on all fours to walking. So in my 3-year-old brain, the thought of crawling, I mean, I never did it. Why would I? So I actually remember being this young kid and walking on the outside of my foot to avoid the blister. And then, you know, thinking how that impacted how I grew, because it was only a few years ago, I was in Mexico with my sister, and I was walking and I got a blister on my toe. And after 2 hours of compensating because of that pain, the next day my whole body was in pain. And it's amazing the compensating and how that affects us. And especially if it happens as we are growing, it's so impactful. So I really hope you're going to be a big part of our Block Therapy Academy for Kids. You have so much to share, and we need your mind, we need your expertise so that we can really get all these kids moving forward in the most amazing way, so that we have a beautiful, bright future for all of them.
Absolutely, absolutely. Quinn, you mentioned about bodybuilding. I remember when we were we were treating some of the MMA and bodybuilders, and they were often astounded by how, when like they would find their way into the clinic because obviously they had injured themselves, but they also wanted to push themselves beyond their limit. And one of the things that always amazed and surprised them was that by using the stabilizers and working on the stabilizers, which require coordination and coordinated firing, which is a direct brain body connection, it's not how much muscle you have, is how many you can fire up at the same time and in a coordinated fashion. So we would work on those stabilizers, and then of course they had been resting because they couldn't lift because of the injuries, and they would go back, and oftentimes they were benching the same, if not more, despite the training, basically. So very, very true. And Deanna, you were talking about the soreness. I remember when the first time that I actually put corrective orthotics, I had flat feet as a kid. And I remember the first time that I put corrective orthotics in my shoes, and I had a long drive, so it wasn't like I was standing on it, but the very fact that I had them in my shoes as I was driving, when I got out, I felt all my muscles having to realign and readjust. And they were literally sore despite the fact that I hadn't used them. And so it's amazing how much our body and our brain kind of change things and tweak things little by little here and there. And for kids, it's instrumental because it literally forms their brain. Um, and one of the things you mentioned about kids and playgrounds, I mentioned at the beginning that, you know, our brain not only controls what goes on inside of us, but how we show up in the world. And when we show up in the world, you have to understand that we also impact the world. We have an impact, right? And as a collective community and society, if we have this improper impact, then what ends up happening is then society starts moving in a direction other than how we remember it. So how you remember us growing up was much more of a lot of times in personal development circles, they talk about surviving versus thriving. And the neurologic term for that is the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic. And the parasympathetic is this rest and digest and healing system of your nervous system. And the sympathetic is the fight and flight part of it, right? So did I mix it up? or did
Nope.
I say it the right way?
Nope.
So
No,
yeah.
that's right.
So when you look at that, if your body is used to sitting down and your higher brain centers are not active, you switch to that reptilian brain, which is much more sympathetic. And as a result, somebody who sits in front of a TV, even though they haven't done anything, at the end of the day, they look like their body has been through war. It's full of
Mm,
stress, and sympathetic people who live in their constant sympathetic system, their body deteriorates and degenerates. They don't live long. Think about any animal that is constantly in a fight or flight situation. They don't live long, basically. So when you look at the society, our society now is much more of a sympathetic driven society as opposed to parasympathetic. You're driven by fears and safety as opposed to thrive and opportunities. The relationships are completely different, even though it's the same bunch of people. What happens in the sympathetic system is you're looking for a win-lose interaction. Whereas when you're in your parasympathetics, you look for win-win situations, you look for cooperation and acceptance and collaboration. So very, very different when it comes to community as well. So this stuff that happens inside of us manifests itself outwardly as
mm,
well.
I think one of the things too that I find so interesting, with block therapy, our blocks are solid, similar to density of bone. And I think about how the couches and the chairs and the beds and everything is so soft. Like I'm sitting here right now on a wooden chair. I can feel both of my sit bones. I feel very grounded in my seat. And I'm
Mhm.
sitting with the alignment that I feel is correct for me. As soon as I sit on a soft surface, my asymmetries really show up. And as you were mentioning with wearing the orthotics and how even though you weren't standing, it affected your body, I have a real sense that the whole comfort aspect of our lives has really impacted us negatively, because if we aren't sitting with a balance, there's going to be a fight going on inside your body, because it's going to always be trying to identify, where am I supposed to be? And it's funny because sometimes as my body is healing, I'll be like, I don't know where I'm supposed to position certain things because they're confused. And I think the softness of things can confuse us. And I've, really recently, like I don't sleep with a pillow anymore. I sleep with no pillow, and I feel like my neck is the best it's ever been. And I just recently, about 4 or 5 months ago, started no pillow. I've worked my way down to make sure my neck is aligned. But yeah, it's funny because we have these different parts where in athletics or sports, we try to drive harder, harder, harder. And then in the rest times, we become more comfortable, but then we fall into those internal spaces and we compress and we block, and we're not developing and we're not keeping our bodies at rest when we're in these soft spaces. So there's so much that we've done to our world has really impacted, our ability to be the best humans we can possibly be, I feel.
Yep, exactly. On that topic of pillows, mattress is another big one, and we are creatures of habit, right? So we learn to sleep on the left side of the bed or the right side of the bed, and in the same position. And well, if you sleep in a position that's not quite aligned, every night, hours and hours, what ends up happening is you're lengthening one set of muscles and shortening and truncating the other set.
totally.
So you're literally starting your next day misaligned and imbalanced, basically. So,
Well,
so yeah, I always used to advise people to make sure you switch bedsides and all that stuff, and have a firm mattress as well. So yeah.
mhm. No, that makes total sense. Like, Deanna, remember Gramp. So my grandpa Deanna's dad, he would always, like for how many hours a day, you'd know better than I, would
Oh,
always lay on the
many.
one side on the couch and just watch hours of TV. And then like that obviously resulted into a lot of issues. But I remember when you were working on him, but we were spending those last final weeks with him. You were like really like ripping his body apart, and we've never seen like these changes so rapidly before. And we're like, oh, only if we could have done that like sooner. But again, sometimes you need that tragedy to be an awakening.
Yeah.
So that was the case with him. Dr. Albert, I have a quick question about so talking about the sympathetic state when we are like in front of a computer all the time. So just to clarify, so if I'm in front of a computer or a television for let's say like 10 hours a day, that's switching on the sympathetic state just because we're sedentary, or how exactly is that working? Or is it because the information we're taking in, it's causing that fight or flight? I was just a little confused on that, because that's
So
intriguing to me.
that's a really good question. So let's clarify this. Remember, I said the most powerful stimulation that you can get to your brain is via movement and gravity, right? So when we sit, we don't get that. So that part of the stimulation does not happen. So as a result, the deeper brain centers that are responsible for coordinating the maestro, the brainstem, they don't become active. So they stop coordinating and signaling all these brain centers. And it's very interesting because we have these learning centers, learning institutions where the kids sit all day long. And if there's any chance of physical activity, they're talking about taking those out of the kids' curriculum as well. And those are the things that actually develops and drives the brain to actually become active, for those executive functions of focus and learning to actually become active. So when you actually go ahead and turn that off and then now ask the child to go ahead and learn something, you're actually working against yourself in the process of how your body is naturally supposed to learn. So the best way for them to do it is actually real life situations, real life circumstances, twisting and the bending and the moving. So that's basically how it's supposed to happen. So if we are sitting in front of a computer, yes, I'm doing that, but like right now I'm standing. Sometimes I have a balance disc that I stand on. Or if I take a break, I go and stand and jump on that basically. So there are different things that we can do to go ahead and do that. A lot of our extensor muscle groups, the ones that keep us upright, those are the muscles that you want to fire up after sitting down naturally, right? So those are the type of things that I oftentimes recommend for the kids so that they can come back and sit and have some level of focus before their next session, basically.
Right.
So the sympathetics happens because normally every brain at its core has this survival thing, right? We want to survive. So that's our deeper reptilian brain. And when we don't get the stimulation, that part is working. Now, if we get the stimulation, then the higher brain centers that are focus and mammalian brain, those areas become active. And their job is to inhibit the sympathetics and in turn on the parasympathetics. So if that area never gets stimulated, the only system that's active is the sympathetics, and the other one never gets activated.
That makes total sense. No wonder why the world is so unhealthy right now.
Yeah,
It's like
exactly,
we're
right?
always in a state of fight or flight. And it's just because that's, and now considering COVID, and we're all, well, in Canada at least, like we're all like pretty much in lockdown. Like this is all I can do. Like all I do is just work on my laptop.
Right.
But
So
that,
so that drives up your cortisol level, right? So then you go out and you have encounters, and rather than the encounter being something that could be a friendly encounter, you feel like people are criticizing you or they're coming at you, and you're much more likely to have a negative reaction to it.
that is brilliant. That makes so much sense. Cause I literally noticed that within myself, and I'm just kind of calling myself out on it because it's true. Like I can feel that at times. That's super interesting. And I guess that's why the whole idea of recess was a thing as well. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like
Yeah.
you're sitting inside learning for 2 hours at a time, 3 hours at a time. Then it's like, okay, go and have your recess, go play, go move around, get things moving, create that stimulation, and then come back and learn. Like for me, if I'm working, like I have to take breaks. There's times where I just go mad and I'm just like, no, I have to finish this project that I'm working on. But that always results into something a little bit more negative. But if I take like 20 minutes to block, or to just do like some movement or a light workout, it's amazing. Like first-handedly, your brain's completely different. You can think of, like, if I'm working on a problem, I can think differently in that problem. I don't stress over that problem as well. You can figure out that problem quicker. So yeah, that's so important, even just for people that are out of adolescence to.
Yeah, think of a standard business meeting, right? A whole bunch of people sitting around the table trying to solve a problem, and And at the end of it, they're all exhausted and frustrated with each other. And it's like they're kind of have their own enclaves of, us versus them and things like that. Now, by the same token, think about the C-suite team building activities that they do. Typically, it happens to be outdoors. Let's go out camp. It's like unrelated to work. Let's go out there. Let's do something. Let's build team. Let's come together. And it's no wonder that works and builds a team. And this one causes that so much frustration, basically. It always comes back to the body connecting with the mind. It gets disconnected when we are sedentary. So
That's brilliant. That just makes that makes me want to get like our team together right now and just do like a field trip or some sort of like activity together.
I know we're kind of missing that interaction right now a little bit.
Oh, I know. Like part of our team that we would see once a week. I remember we didn't see one of our team members for, it was like what, 6-8 months. And it's like, and we're all just in front of our computers working, we're interacting, but it's a lot different than that actual in-person human interaction. So yeah,
so
I'm missing
choice. You have that choice. For instance, we have this pandemic going on, right? Like you're describing it. And we have the choice of sitting behind our screens and doing this, which some of it is necessary, of course. But then at the same time, I grabbed my kids this last summer and we did a 5,000-mile road trip, and we stopped often in the wilderness. We did camping, we did hiking, we did all kinds of different activities to not only see the world, but also kind of bond together. And that's something that we need to do. Not only is it healthy for us, but it allows us to continue our civilization as it used to be.
Totally.
Wow.
Yeah.
So Dr. L, you're just a wealth of information and wisdom, and I am so incredibly honored and blessed that we have connected and that you are here sharing with our community. And I know we're going to be doing so many wonderful things together in the future. And you have this amazing talk coming up, so we'll have links for everybody to find you. Is there any last words that you would like to share just to really set 2021 in the healthiest way possible for the parents, for the kids, for the grandparents, for humanity in general?
Yeah, I always end my phrases by saying, optimize your brain and you can optimize humanity's potential. And I think nowhere has it been even more important than at the beginning of 2021 for us to, instead of looking for solutions out there, to just go back to the basics and focus on making sure that our health is intact, that we can be the best self that we can be for the world, for our families, and for ourselves.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. And we will definitely be inviting you back again because people are going to want to see you more. You just exude this most amazing calm presence. You're clearly connected to your parasympathetic nervous system.
100%. I got that sense like right away. I'm like, I could talk to Dr. L all day long and I wouldn't get, even though I'm sitting in front of a computer, which is ironic, I could talk to him all day long and feel calm and absorb all of his information. No,
I agree.
I try to practice what I preach. And if my ADHD can do this, anybody can.
Yeah.
Well, you are a glowing example, and thank you so much. And best of luck to you this weekend. Can't wait to watch it. And Quinn, is there any last things you'd like to share?
I'm gonna end it by this awesome comment from Lorette. Thank you for sharing this discussion today. This has been so informative, educational, and wonderful to hear. It's very encouraging to hear that we can keep changing our brains and bodies all of our lives. So our community has clearly loved this discussion, and yeah, like I'm just so excited that we're connected to you, and we're gonna be working on the Academy for Kids program, because like we hear it all the time, like the kids are our future, but the kids are our future. And now just with the state of the world being so bizarre and we're so twisted and just life is completely different compared to 100 years ago, we need to start bringing that brain back. We have to start rewiring or training that brain correctly, especially in that really specific time frame. So yeah, I'm just so looking forward to this. And again, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. I look forward to it. Thanks, Diana. Thanks, Quinn, for the opportunity.
Our pleasure. And thank you everyone for joining us. And we will see you in 2 weeks when we have our next Fascia Master discussion with, well, we'll keep it a surprise.
Awesome. And if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you like this video, leave any comments below. You can access all of Dr. L's links, his TED Talk, which is on, I believe, Friday, or on the weekend. You can clarify that.
I think we start on Friday. It's a long process, but it's 12 hours. This is one of the longest TEDx's that have been done, the TEDx
Wow.
Tenai Paseo in Vegas. So
Amazing.
very excited about
Amazing.
it. Invite all of you guys there.
Perfect. So all of those links to access are going to be below. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel, and we will see you all next time.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, guys.